My name's Pauline. Welcome to Hawthorn Readings on behalf of myself and my colleagues Noah, Mark and Annie who are here with us tonight. And thank you for joining in this wonderful event where we have two esteemed gentlemen to keep us entertained and engaged this evening. Alan Kohler doesn't really need much introduction, and some of you may have seen him here a couple of weeks ago, so we're getting first name basis with Alan here in Hawthorn and loving every minute of it.
A friend.
And of course Bill, who I've never met before, but I've had a quick glance at his book. And I just wanted to note, because I don't know if some of you are like me, that when things come to money, if it wasn't for Alan, you wouldn't pay any attention to finance matters whatsoever. But when I picked up this book, I thought it's not like the typical finance book that you find on the shelf. And I hope you would just indulge me a moment while I read the dedication. Bill's dedication, which he's given me permission to read, says, "Dedicated to the millions of unemployed and their families who have been treated as fodder by policymakers around the world in their misguided attempts to advance the profit interests of the wealthy." So I read that and I thought, it's not your typical finance book. So it made me ready to hear a bit more. So please welcome the two gentlemen here tonight.
Thank you.
G'day, Bill. Is that working? Hello. Yes.
Yeah. So, Alan's.
Very close. Yeah.
We're just going to ad lib. And when I spoke to Alan earlier this week, we decided our objective was to have some fun. So that's what we're just going to take it from there.
So, and I thought we would open for questions from you too. After I've exhausted myself or run out of questions.
And I've got questions for you, Alan, by the way.
Oh, he's got questions. He's got questions for me. That's not allowed. Sorry, can't possibly have that.
I've got a list of them.
Now, listen. I thought maybe we could start. Firstly, I wanted to say what a great book it is. I've read it. It's really worth reading. It's engaging and informative. So I thought maybe you could start by telling us about how you first came across Warren Mosler, because it's an excellent adventure. The whole thing's about your adventure with Warren in, developing modern monetary theory, and maybe because it's interesting how you two came across each other.
Yeah, it's sort of a chalk and cheese story.
That's right.
There's me in my blue suit with my running shoes, and there's Warren in his polo shirt. And he's a tennis addict. He lives in the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean. And Warren is a very eccentric guy, but he has some of the largest speculative trades in foreign currencies in history. That's sort of the sort of character he is. He's a ex-Wall Street banker, speculator, but a really creative individual. Like, he builds racing cars and stuff like that, and it's one of those unity of science stories, because I'm just a conventional academic in the sense that I live in an ivory tower. I sit in front of computers these days. In the past it was in libraries, and I work things out deductively and think things out. Whereas Warren is an experienced sort of guy, and he's got an undergraduate degree from a college system in America. But he's a genius, and in the very early days of the internet, MMT, modern monetary theory, is an internet phenomenon. Because in the early days of the internet, so we're going back to 1994, and I was a young academic, and it was the first of the listservs, if you remember those, these email discussion lists. And in the past, when as a young academic, you'd sort of want to know something about a famous economist. In my case, you'd write a snail mail letter and ask some questions, or seek some data or something, And, you know, like 3 months later you might get a reply. And so these email lists in the early 90s, 94 this particular one started, it was like a revolution to us, you know, because every day you could interact with the top economists in the world who were on the list. And one day this guy Warren Mosler turned up on the list. So it started off an academic list, and then it got invaded by all of these spooky libertarians and Austrian economists and everyone, all these unpalatable types. And they all had a plan for save the world. And when Warren turned up here, you know, I thought, oh, bloody hell, another one of these characters. And he started writing and to the list, and it was the only person I'd ever run into who had similar ideas to my own, because I was on the outside of the profession anyway by then, well, always. And so yeah, we got to know each other through that list in 1996, and then one day I got a phone call and in Newcastle, Saturday afternoon, and this American accent says, "Oh, I'm Warren Mosler. I've flown to Australia."
How did he get your phone number?
I don't know. Maybe it was through the email list.
Oh, actually, those are the days of the white pages.
Yeah.
He probably just looked you up in the phone book.
He might have, but also I think because we had signatures on our emails at that stage.
Oh, okay.
He probably found it there, because I'm not sure I had a mobile phone, and I had a mobile phone around then, one of those huge Nokia, remember those?
Yeah, I do.
That you pulled out the area. Yeah, it was pretty cool. But yeah, he said, "Look, I've flown out to Australia to meet you."
So what did you do, you and Warren, when he arrived? So he showed up in Newcastle,
We had lunch
You had lunch? Where'd you go?
in my backyard.
Oh, in your backyard, right.
Yeah, I mean, I was living on a little farm, sort of a permaculture, that a couple of acres down the bottom end of Lake Macquarie, if you know that area. And we were experimenting with permaculture and stuff, and yeah, so we had a big backyard actually. And yeah, we just sat in the backyard.
And at that point, had the term modern monetary theory been invented?
No,
or
we
not?
didn't even know what we were doing. I mean, we were just sketching ideas in those days and trying to work out how we could bring, because Warren has I've got an academic mind. I know the literature. I read all the classics, and you know, so I build knowledge up that way. He builds it by trading. That's how he learned. You know, you'd have more affinity with Warren because of your association with the professional side of the markets, and he just worked everything out by inductive logic, just doing it.
And so I suppose the thing we need to get into now is that you each approached the subject from a different point of view, right? So you approached it from the point of view of employment, and you had at that point come up with what you call the buffer stock of employment BSE model, and Warren approached it from another point of view, which was a financial one, which was
the bond markets.
The bond markets, but also the issue of, or the question of how money is made and how money and how governments spend money and so on. And his idea, as I understand it, was, and I've also interviewed Warren, so I kind of got that from him as well, was the idea that taxation is what creates unemployment.
Yeah.
And so you both kind of ended up talking about unemployment, but came at it from different ways. And it'd be great to just hear you explain to us, firstly, how you got there, what your process of thinking was that got you there, and then to describe, as you understand it, how Warren got there.
Well, I got there many years earlier as a fourth-year student at Melbourne University. And in those days you did a minor for your honours year, that's your 4th year, you did 6 coursework units and a minor thesis. And one of the subjects I took, my electives, was agricultural economics. And this was 1978. And if there's people old enough to remember what was going on there in the room, 1978 was as unemployment was starting to rise. It was just after the Lynch, Fraser, Razor gang that started to hack into government employment, apprenticeships, spending. And for the first time, unemployment really started to rise. So I'm sitting in this agricultural economics class. A.G. Lloyd was the famous agricultural economist of Australia. He taught me. I mean, I was really privileged to...
And you learned about the wool price mechanism.
Yeah, he was teaching us one day the wool price stabilisation scheme. And for those who don't know, this was a scheme, if you remember back in the years, those big red buildings in the inner suburbs, those monstrous 4-storey buildings, they were the wool stores. And they're now gentrified apartments, but they were in all the cities. And this was a scheme, the Australian government was lobbied by the farm lobby, because up until then the farm incomes would fluctuate wildly, depending on the clip and the state of the clip. And so they lobbied the government, the National Party lobbied the government to bring in a price stabilisation scheme to even out their incomes. And this involved the government buying wool if there was a surplus of wool in the market so that it wouldn't drive the price down, and then they'd store it in their big red brick buildings, and then if the price looked like going above the stabilised price because there was an excess demand of wool, the government would sell it out of the wool stores. So I wasn't that interested in wool, but I was sort of thinking during that lecture, the first lecture on that scheme, I said, bloody hell, this is a full employment of wool scheme. And I was a left-wing boy, and my profession, the most disgusting profession in history, economists.
Steady on.
That was soft going. They were all, at that time, they were all writing in the literature that the full employment was now 8%. You know, we'd had 2% for three or four decades, and then unemployment was starting to rise, and they said, oh yeah, the full employment level of unemployment now to stabilised inflation was about 8%, and the government had to force unemployment up to stabilise inflation, because if you remember, inflation was a problem in the 70s because of the OPEC oil prices rises, when, you know, the price of oil in October 73 doubled overnight. And so I just had a thought during that day. I'm in the lecture, and I said, okay, this is a full employment of wool. This means that the government could create full employment of labour by buying up surplus labour and selling it back at a fixed price to when there was high demand for labour in the private sector. And then I started to get really interested in buffer stocks, where governments, and these had a long history in agricultural economics, where governments would have commodity buffers to stabilise prices. And I figured that could be the way we could deal with the inflation problem, which required the government to cut spending, but not create unemployment. In other words, they would force workers through spending cuts out of their private jobs and then absorb them back into this buffer stock of public sector jobs. And that's where I got the idea from. And I called that the BSE model, buffer stock employment model, of course, in my academic bent. And then, of course, in the 90s, the mad cow disease came along, which was BSE.
Oh, that's right.
And I thought, bloody, we better not, I better change it. And we eventually, and then I met Warren, who had worked out a similar pattern. That's the unity of science aspect.
Yes.
And from totally different principles. And so we decided to call it the job guarantee. Now he'd worked it all out from And the other thing that I suddenly realised was that the government could buy whatever available resources were available in its own currency. That's a corollary of the BSC model, and that by government setting the price of one commodity, in other words, the wage that it was willing to pay for this job guarantee worker, they could condition the overall price level. And so I sort of worked out that the government had no financial constraint, but also could condition general price level by targeting one price, labour, and offering a fixed price to anyone who didn't have a job. And that was...
And what in your mind was the fixed price?
Well, some socially inclusive wage. Now,
Was it the minimum wage?
well, it would become the minimum wage. It would have to become the minimum wage.
Yes, you're right, of course.
Because the private sector wouldn't be able to employ anyone below that because they would all go into the government job.
And how do you imagine that the government would decide on that wage?
Well, this, later work I did, and this was work I did for the South African government on setting their minimum wage system up. The work I did in South Africa on their minimum wage, designing their minimum wage system for the government, was to abandon the concept of capacity to pay and create and say that the minimum wage should be set at the level of sophistication you want your society, the minimum level of sophistication you want your society to function at, and then the private sector has to adjust to that. And of course, I remember when I was in Johannesburg, the IMF official said, oh yeah, but all these private sector companies can't charge, wouldn't be able to afford that.
It's a bit like the Harvester judgment of 1907.
Yeah, exactly. And the Harvester judgment was the famous judgment that set up the whole arbitrated wage system in Australia, the award system. And yeah, the argument I gave back to the IMF and the World Bank official that day was that, well, if these private companies can't pay the minimum wage, then they either go out of business or they invest in better capital, so they lift productivity, which would allow them to pay the wage. Because society's got to make judgments about what your minimum standards of living are, not capitalists. Society makes that, and government's our agent, so it should do it on our behalf. That's what
I was surprised to read in your book about Benjamin Graham being referred to, and I've known Benjamin Graham as the author of The Intelligent Investor and being being a value investment guru, obviously from the 1930s and 40s. And being the guru or the thinking behind Warren Buffett, but for you he's something different.
Well,
and so I'd be very interested.
Stocks. He did a lot of work on commodity buffers as a way to stabilise prices in commodity markets, because he was speculating in commodity markets, and he wanted to work out ways in which you could control the variance of the price. So I got interested in him as part of that work in my fourth year of uni. That was in my term paper in that subject.
You quoted him saying, the first conclusion is that wherever surplus has been conserved primarily for future use, the plan has been sensible and successful unless marred by glaring errors of administration. The second conclusion is that when the surplus has been acquired and held primarily for future sale, the plan's been vulnerable to adverse development. So it depends on how it's used, right?
Yeah, and I mean one of the big differences between a primary commodity. So buffer stocks have been used to stabilise prices in agricultural markets. But one of the problems of, say, using agricultural commodities is that they rot or they deteriorate. And the other problem, of course, is that once you have a expectation from the farmer that they can just keep overproduce and sell their overproduction, you get the classic subsidy problem that they'll just produce forever because they've got a fixed market to buy in. Now, a lot of mainstream economists have attacked me over the years about buffer stock solutions to unemployment. But if you think about it, no family's going to start breeding like crazy to increase the number of workers just to create unemployment so they'll be on social inclusive minimum wage. And secondly, you know, if you've got people in employment, the problem of unemployment, one of the pathologies of unemployment is that, you know, that people, you know, social psychologists have studied this in depth. You start off with a social network this big, and after several months of unemployment, your network starts to shrink, and eventually you're lying in bed in fetal position, depressed. That's one of the problems of unemployment. Whereas if you've got a job, if you're never facing unemployment, well then you're less likely to have those sort of pathologies. So it's not as if you're going to rot. So the problems that pervade agricultural buffer stock systems wouldn't be pertinent to
So the wool buffer stock system was funded by a levy on sheep growers, right?
Yeah.
How would the employment buffer stock be funded?
Well, I mean, then you...
Here we go.
Now, I'll ask a question of the audience. How many of people do you, in the audience here, have a really good understanding on the way the government spends? Yeah, the MMTs who know me do. How many people know where government spending comes from? Have you thought about this? How many people think that you as taxpayers provide currency for the government to spend? Come on, get your hands up. Yeah. And how many people think that if the government spends more than it raises in tax revenue, they borrow from the financial markets to spend? Yeah.
Well, they print money.
Well, after this, can you take me and find a printer? The way the government spends, taxes do not provide the funds for the federal government of Australia to spend. The federal government of Australia issues the currency that we use. So it's like, it doesn't print anything. It's like saying that, now I vote for Melbourne unfortunately, he votes for Essendon, which is just as bad as bad, but...
It's worse, come on.
Oh, I don't know. But imagine in the 3 minutes into the third quarter of a footy game, there's suddenly an announcement goes over the MCG broadcasting system. Sorry, the game has to stop because the scoreboard's run out of points. What would you think about that? You'd say, this is absurd, get off. It's a digital scoreboard, bang, bang, bang. The computer operator just, as goals get created or points. Imagine if you were standing at the tramway system said, oh, we've run out of tickets today. You'd say, you can't run out of tickets. They're digital. You might not be able to get on the tram because there's not enough capacity. But you can't run out of tickets. You've always got a ticket. The Australian government can never run out of Australian dollars because it issues the currency. And how does the government spend? Well, every day the Treasury Department advises the Department of Finance to advise the Reserve Bank of Australia to type numbers into bank accounts. That's it. That's government spending. It's already funded. It's already financed by the typing. So then you ask me, well, what do your taxes do? And this relates to your point about Warren.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good opportunity to talk a little about what Warren's insights were.
Yeah,
anyway.
Well, Warren was a fixed income trader, which means that fixed income means government bonds or anything with a fixed yield on the asset. And he made his name by trading government bonds, particularly cross-currency trades. He worked out that currency issuing governments can never run out of money. And so then you ask yourself, well, God, well, what does that mean? You know, what are all the... Because that's a foundational principle of mainstream economics, that the government is like a household. And all of us have financing problems. So I'm at work today because I need income. And if I want to spend more than my income, I have to perhaps run down prior savings, or I have to go on eBay and sell something, or I go to the bank and borrow. So I've got a financial constraint, Alan's got a financial constraint, we all have. Why? Because we're users of the currency. Whose currency is it? Governments. They've got no financial constraint. And think about this, if I suddenly declared today, I'm taking over this room and making a new country, I've got a military out there, and if you try to get out there, bang. And for the privilege of being in my country, you now owe me $100 in tax. Now, it's my currency. I've got a new currency as well. So what's your problem? To stay in my country, you now have to pay me $100 a week. What's your problem? 100 of bill dollars, not Australian dollars.
Willies.
What?
We'll call them willies.
Whatever you want. You don't have it.
Exactly.
You don't have it. How are you going to get it?
By, put yourself
Off. No, who to?
You.
Well, I'm not a financer. I'm a government who's offering public services. How are you going to get my currency? You've got to offer your resources to me, and I've got to procure them and pay you my currency as income. Then you can pay your taxes. So if you've done first year logic at uni or any time, you don't even need to do logic to work this out. How can something that comes after something cause something? Can't. So before you can pay your taxes, I have to spend the currency. So the spending of the currency actually finances your ability to pay the taxes, not the other way around. That's sort of what Warren had worked out.
Yeah.
And that's a massive breakthrough in as opposed to mainstream thinking. Massive restructuring of thought.
It is, correct.
Now,
So this all came about because I asked you how you're going to fund the BSE
oh yeah, well they
and the
fund
job
it-
guarantee. So
Well, they're going to fund full employment, or as they fund anything, by typing numbers into computers. That's it. It's funded. That's as simple as it. I mean, you might be surprised by that. That's how governments spend.
So the constraint on government spending is inflation, not the existence of money, right?
Yeah.
So why isn't a job guarantee inflationary?
Because it's a fixed price for a resource that has zero market bid. So that's jargon. What does it mean? Well, what it means is, let's say that there's all the productive resources, including labour, are fully employed. You know, we've got enough spending in the economy to have everything humming along at full capacity. Then the government gets an idea it wants to have a green transition of some sort. That means it's got to acquire more public resources, public production, and it's got to go out in the markets and somehow get hold of more resources to fulfil its new program. So yeah, it can go out into the market and get those resources. How? By outbidding the current users, because everyone's being used. Now, if it can do it because it's got no financial constraint, it can buy whatever was available for sale in Australian dollars, but what will that do? It'll create excess demand for the goods, for the resources, inflation. So in that situation, how can the government still fulfil its ambition and not cause inflation? Not come up against inflation? Well, the answer is it's got to deprive some of the existing users of those resources of the ability to use them. How might it do that? Well, it could do it through dictate, just say, we're taking them off you. It doesn't do that, of course. How else might it do it? Well, it's got to reduce our disposable income. Because if it reduces as a sector, if it reduces our disposable income, then we can't buy as much stuff and there'll be resources that are unused. So how does it do that? Enter taxation. Taxation doesn't fund the spending. I'll say this very slowly. It creates the resource space for government to spend into and not cause inflation. And a simpler way of saying that is it causes unemployment. Because it deprives us of the ability to buy resources, spend, or for firms to buy labour, whatever. It deprives the non-government sector, us, of the ability to use all the available productive resources, and then the government can spend and bring those unemployed resources back into productive use without causing inflation. So taxation, that's the role of taxation. So that answers the question that I often used to get asked at the beginning of all of this. If the government hasn't got any financial constraint, then why the hell do we get taxed? Well, that's why you get taxed, because the government has to ensure that there's enough unused resources to fulfil we call it the provisioning story of MMT. It's to provision itself, because the government doesn't have any resources. We're the ones with the trucks and the labour and the skills, etc. So the government has to work out how to provision itself so that it can provide services and build infrastructure. And it does that by depriving us of the use of resources through taxation, and then brings them back into productive use through its spending. The taxes do not fund the spending.
Right, so but getting back to the job guarantee now. So the the taxation creates unemployment.
Yeah.
The job guarantee soaks up the unemployment. Join those dots for us.
Okay, so it's a circuitous join up, because they're not necessarily the same logic. Now, what do I mean by that? The job guarantee isn't a job creation program. A lot of people, and some MMTers even, the ones that came after us who have picked up on our work, have said, oh, well, the job guarantee is a solution to everything. Well, for Warren and I, the goal for government always should be to absolutely minimise the job guarantee size. The last thing you want to aspire to is to create minimum wage jobs. All we said at the time and since, and we explain that in the book, is that a job guarantee is better than unemployment. It's better than unemployment. But if you want to have, a lot of the American MMTs say, if we have what they call a Green New Deal, and I hate that expression, but they say, let's have a Green New Deal, and they understand it's going to be incredibly dislocating in the employment markets. Transitioning from carbon to non-carbon is going to be diabolical, and it's going to create, labour that's going to be shed. So their solution, let's have a job guarantee. Well, that's never what Warren and I conceived. We thought that if in that case you'd want the government to have very carefully worked out public sector work, high-paid, productive, career-based work. That should be the aspiration of government at all times. But when you have to put the brakes on demand and create unemployment, as we're doing at the moment, then the job guarantee is better than unemployment.
So what would people who are on the job guarantee and paid the minimum wage be doing?
Well, in 2008, I got an Australian Research Council grant, one of several that I've had, but that particular was a linkage project where I worked with Jobs Australia, which was sort of the peak body of all of the not-for-profit job network agencies at the time. So they weren't the profiteering ones, they were the not-for-profit agencies. And that project, we did a national survey of all the local governments, and we asked them, if the federal government funded a social inclusive minimum wage job, what sort of jobs could you create, supervise and provide for in environmental care services, personal care services, community development? We got our inventory of jobs is in the millions that they could offer. So what we learned was there no shortage, which would be really value-adding jobs. What we learned was that and it's a fundamental principle, is that there's no shortage of jobs, there's just a shortage of people who want to pay for them, the work. And when I was developing these ideas as a younger academic, I wanted to also push the sort of limits of the debate a bit. And I'd get asked, well, what sort of jobs would you allow to be in the job guarantee? And I've been a surfer, and one of the problems on the Australian summer is the number of people who drown in the sea. And last summer there were several drownings. And so I said, okay, well, I'd employ surfers. Well, what would they do? Surf, obviously. And have fun. And what else would they do then? Well, they would take water safety classes for school kids on beaches. Because as a surfer, you know the rips and you know the quickest way to get out to the break. And so the surfers could, as their mutual obligation, as their reciprocal obligation under the job guarantee scheme, they could surf a bit and they could take school kid classes on water safety. Would that be productive? Well, under the way we measure productivity at the moment, that wouldn't be productive work. But the way I measure productivity in terms of social value rather than private profit value, that would be incredibly productive. Imagine the family tragedies of all these people that drown all the time. So that's an example of...
Well, you just have to, in order to make it productive, you'd have to just add it to GDP.
Yeah, well, the wage you paid would add it to GDP, but one of the things that the critics bring up all the time is they use this expression boondoggling. Boondoggling is just to put down for, it's just make work. I've been on these so-called make work and painting rock schemes. I've never painted a rock in my life, but and the sort of, I talk about it a bit in the book that, when I was an unemployed surfer musician down on the coast in my younger years, we planted out all of the sand dunes down along the Bowen Heads beach with marangay and saved those dunes. They were government community development jobs in those days. And you go back much earlier, the 1930s. Well, who built the Great Ocean Road? You hang out down the Great Ocean Road. Who built it?
Yeah.
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 Community jobs during the Depression. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar tourist resource.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that for you, modern monetary theory is really all about the job guarantee, about employment?
No.
Okay, what else is it about?
It's about understanding the capacities of the currency issuing government and the consequences of using those capacities, and the way in which us, as a general body, understand the capacities of our federal government is erroneous. We don't understand it. And we've been led by my profession to accept a fictional world, which then leads us to accept poor policy that's actually damaging to the nation, damaging to the climate, damaging to ourselves.
So I suppose this is before I go to audience questions, but the question is obviously, why hasn't this taken off? I mean, what has stopped these ideas of yours and of you and Warren actually becoming part of government policy?
Well, it's quite interesting because there was a famous quote Paul Samuelson was an American macroeconomist, famous American economist. And he, in his later years, he gave an interview as part of a movie sponsored by Cambridge University in England on the 50 years of Keynes. And in that interview, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, the stuff that economists talk about, budgets and stuff, he said, effectively was saying, it's okay to lie, we lie about that. Because the lie is useful because it maintains social stability. And he said, because if people found, and I'm paraphrasing, if people found out the truth about how government finances are and what they can do and what they can't do, then there would be so many demands on the government to do stuff that it would become unviable. And he said that economics is a bit like, it serves the same purpose as religion has served historically, to maintain social order. And I think that was, in other words, lie to the people so that they don't get bolshy.
So I take it I take it you don't believe that's valid?
No, I don't think you should lie to the people, because lying to the people means that we ask different questions of our politicians and we accept different answers than we would if we knew the truth. I don't accept hardly anything the politicians say because I think I know what the reality is. Whereas people in this audience who think their taxes are funding government spending will accept different answers from politicians, and they'll be answers that will undermine our prosperity.
That's why I asked you about the job guarantee being the basis of what you're on about, because, I mean, apart from the existence of unemployment, it could be argued that the idea of government as a household is a reasonable proxy for keeping the politicians under control, except for the fact that the current policies do result in people being unemployed.
Well, unemployed, it's the last count, there's 800,000 shortage of social houses. There's decaying infrastructure. Try working in the university system these days. It's a chaos. It's a disgrace what's happening to our education system. Our privatised training system is a disaster. Our energy supply is a disaster. I mean, you know, we're about to import gas when we produce much more gas than we ever need. Why? Because of all this stuff. So it's not just unemployment. Unemployment's a social tragedy. But all these other things, our way of, you know, the climate's, we're 1.7 over the regenerative power capacity of the Earth. And what are we doing about it? We're allowing more gas to be produced. You know, we've got our ex-Prime Minister bringing in lumps of coal to Parliament.
Okay, I'm chastened.
Thanks.
Anyone else got a question? Here you go.
You began by talking about the ability of national governments to print their money.
I didn't say print.
Oh, sorry.
Can I just clarify that? The way in which you frame things and the words you use is very important to conditioning the way people then understand the phenomenon. So when mainstream economists continually talk about printing money, they immediately invoke Weimar Republic, Zimbabwe, and all of the negativity involved in government fiscal policy. But the reality, as I said, is there's no printers involved. So it's been used as a pejorative term to frame and put that language, frames you into immediately accepting that government deficits are in some way bad.
It's okay.
Yeah.
My question really relates to whether you have a currency like Bitcoin, which is not controlled by a nation, and is that a disruptor to any of this?
Well, the answer to your question is that the demand for the viability of a nation's currency depends upon what's accepted to relinquish your tax obligations. That's, I mean, we don't no longer have commodity-backed currencies. The coins are worthless. They're worthless tokens. So what gives them value? The fact that you've got to get them to pay your taxes. You can't pay your taxes with Bitcoin. You can't pay your taxes with US dollars. You've got to get Australian dollars. And that's why, you know, I'm not against all of these let schemes, these local little exchange type transaction systems. But they can never become a broader currency because the Australian government will never accept them in return for your tax obligations. That's what gives demand to the worthless fiat currency.
Would you accept the use of the word create as opposed to print?
The government spends its own currency into existence.
Yeah.
That's government spending. It spends its own currency into existence, and if you really, it comes from nowhere. How can a keystroke come from anywhere? There's no story, you know. We could go on a sort of tour to try to find where all this currency is. Well, we'd never find it. It comes from nowhere.
Do you want this?
My question, I think, is marginally relevant to your discussion, but it seems
Well, we
to
hope
me
so.
when politicians strut up and down saying, we've got a surplus, I think that's a failure of governance. You shouldn't have a surplus, you should be spending it all.
Well, a lot of people, you know, this is a really interesting thing because Australian government, since data goes back to the 1920s or something, that we've got sort of coherent data, has run fiscal deficits about 80% of the time. And so this period of the couple of years of Keating and then Costello's 10 out of 11 years, they were abnormal, not the norm. We've been conditioned to think that that's the norm. We've got to get that the surplus is the norm and deficit's abnormal. That's not historically correct. But here's the thing about surpluses. Let's go back to my little arithmetic example. So you've got 20 bucks in the bank from my currency because I've been running deficits. And then one year I decide, the IMF rings me up and says, how are you going to go broke? And so you've got to reduce national debt, blah, blah. So I give you $80 in employment, but I want $100 back in taxes. What's your problem now? So I'm running a surplus, aren't I? Spending 80, getting 100 in tax, I'm running a surplus of 20. What's your problem?
I've got the deficit, I think.
You've got a deficit now, haven't you? Non-government sector's in deficit because you're only getting 100 income from the government, but you've got to pay, 80 from the government, and you've got to pay 100. So your problem is you've got a deficit. What's your problem? You've got to finance that deficit. Where are you going to get the money from? Or sell wealth, liquidate wealth. When Costello was saying we're getting the debt monkey off our back, when he said we'll get the debt monkey off our back, what he should have been saying was I'm systematically destroying non-government sector wealth. That's what a fiscal surplus does. Systematically destroys non-government sector wealth.
What about when the surplus, as it did under Costello, comes from commodity exports?
Good question. There's no good or bad deficits. The fiscal position can't be evaluated without a contextual reference. So if a 2% fiscal deficit of GDP is no better than a 10% deficit or a 4% surplus. It all depends. So take a country like Norway that has really large export income from its North Sea energy resources. So that's coming in from the rest of the world. It can still provide first-class public services. The private sector can still, private domestic sector can still save some overall, yet the government has to run a surplus. Why? Because otherwise the economy would overheat because of the external income coming in. Whereas take a country like Australia, we typically have run 3% current account deficit since the 70s. This current period's a bit of an abnormal thing.
Well, so was the mid-2000s, but yeah.
Yeah, but we've typically run on average about 3% deficits on external sector. That means we're losing our income to the rest of the world. The income we're producing in Australia isn't getting recycled back into Australian spending. It's going elsewhere. So in that case, and if their private domestic sector, that's households and firms, want to save a bit, so they're going to withdraw some of their income from the spending stream, well, the government has to run a deficit in that case and inject spending into the stream, or else the economy will go into deep recession. Has to. So see the context? It depends upon what the other sectors are doing. And the idea, by the way, that leads to the other important insight. The idea that the government can actually control its fiscal outcome, its deficit or its surplus, is erroneous. So when you see treasurers get up and say, oh, we're going to deliver this sort of surplus or this sort of deficit, well, they've got no clue they can do that because its final fiscal position is dependent upon what we do. Because if we stop spending, it's going to go into deficit no matter what. It can target a surplus and it'll still record a deficit because we're not spending enough. Employment's going to fall, tax revenue falls, welfare spending increases, it goes into deficit whether it likes it or not. The non-government sector determines the fiscal outcome, not the government. There's a question down there.
Eva, you might. So it gets picked up.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks so much, Bill. Looking forward to reading this book, reading to hear others. I guess really the big question is, what is it going to take to change the narrative, in the public policy narrative? I mean, obviously know the economic professions are beholden to into real world macroeconomics, but what will it take to really articulate and bring about the public policy narrative that we desperately need when we're facing the existential threat of climate change and so much else? And yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and that relates to Alan's question really that I didn't fully answer about, politicians and stuff. I mean, when Warren and I first started in the mid-90s, and he brought another couple of Americans into the project very early, they were sort of like the gridiron cheer squads. They said, oh, no worries, this will be all over by the end of the century. That's true. They were really optimistic that once we got this written out and went out and gave conference presentations, the profession would change. Now, I said, my response at the time was, well, you bloody Americans, this is beyond my lifetime. And that I saw my work, and I've seen my academic work as, for posterity, as laying out the knowledge base that will eventually be taken up, maybe. That's what I saw my role.
But the place that has picked it up is Japan.
Sort of.
Sort of. But what is it about Japan that enabled them to sort of pick it up? Was it the 89-90 collapse that sort of made them, caused them to have to do it?
Yeah, I mean, Japan's my laboratory. I work in Japan now each year for a few months, and I've got really close contacts in Japan with officials and things. And Japan is a really interesting, and there's a chapter in the book about Japan. And Japan had as Alan referred to, had a massive collapse in '91. They had an incredible asset price boom, particularly in commercial real estate in Tokyo, mainly Tokyo, a bit of in Osaka. And of course that collapsed in '91, and Japan had 1 quarter of negative GDP in the following period. Now if that happened in Melbourne, in Australia, we would have a '91 style recession for months, for quarters and quarters and quarters. And what they last year I was actually talking to an owner of a business in Kyoto where I work, and he said, what you ought to understand, I was talking to him about research and stuff, and he said, what you've got to understand is that the corporate sector hates to create unemployment, hates to lay workers off. They'll do everything possible not to lay off a worker. And that sort of solidaristic view is permeated throughout Japanese society. Why I say it's my laboratory is that their fiscal policy in the 90s was outrageous by mainstream standards. You know, running 10% GDP deficits, it's huge, relatively. And you know, you'd had the Nobel Prize winners from America swanning across through Japan as economists tend to swan around the joint, applying their one-size-fits-all to everything, and telling the Japanese government and the Bank of Japan, oh, you're going to go broke, you're going to get accelerated, bond markets will stop buying the Japanese government bonds, there'll be accelerating inflation, blah, blah. None of that ever happened because of what's in there. That's why I call it my laboratory. They've pushed policy limits beyond what anybody imagined, and none of the mainstream predictions have ever come true.
So is it simply that the culture that caused them? Because I mean, obviously, when anyone has a recession, there's a big fiscal response, you know, particularly
an automatic one.
Yeah, well, no, but also, you know, in Australia when we had the GFC, there was a huge fiscal response. Yeah. There was huge fiscal response to the pandemic as well. Yeah. Yeah. But it never lasts, right? But the difference in Japan is it lasted from 91 till now. Till now,
yeah.
So is it simply culture?
But the other thing you didn't say was that their unemployment rate never hardly goes above 3%. A crisis to them is an unemployment rate of 4%.
So do they have...
They care about their people more, so they're willing to run bigger deficits to keep unemployment down, to keep the transport systems operating. They've got first-class rail transport. There's very little homelessness in everybody's got access to first-class healthcare. That requires deficits. They really value education, public education. Their public infrastructure is first class. That requires deficits. And that's because they've got a vision of a society that benefits people. We think that the role of government is to run surpluses.
So Japan kind of proves that modern monetary theory is not inflationary.
Definitely does.
Yeah.
I mean, the Bank of Japan, since 2008, when Shinzo Abe came in with his Abenomics, the Bank of Japan has bought almost all of it's bought more than the government debt that's been issued in that time. Printing money.